Welcome to the deep dive. We like to get into some thought-provoking stuff, and today we're diving into Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s A Letter to Liberals. We're focusing on the excerpts dealing with COVID-19 vaccines and policies surrounding that, and yeah, it's a lot.
It is a lot, and it really does challenge a lot of the mainstream narrative that we've all kind of come to accept over the last couple of years.
Right, yeah. So how about we just dive right in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so right off the bat, Kennedy Jr. tackles this idea that vaccines ended the pandemic single-handedly. He actually claims there's data suggesting mass vaccination correlated with a rise in COVID cases.
Right, yeah. He brings up this study that was published in the European Journal of Epidemiology
Yeah.
that found that there was a correlation between higher vaccination rates and then higher COVID-19 case numbers per capita in a number of countries.
Ah.
He also talks about specific instances like South Korea and Australia.
Oh.
Both had very high vaccination rates, and yet in 2022, they had these huge outbreaks with a lot of deaths.
So, it directly contradicts what we were initially told about the vaccines.
Yeah. It really makes you think back to,
Yeah.
all those early promises.
Right, this is going to stop the spread, and
This is the way out, yeah.
yeah, this is the way out. Okay, so then he gets into this concept of negative efficacy.
Yeah.
And for someone like me who doesn't have a scientific background, can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So negative efficacy basically means that in certain cases, the vaccinated population becomes more susceptible to COVID-19 than the unvaccinated.
Oh, wow.
And he points to a study in The Lancet.
That's a pretty reputable
Yeah, it's a very reputable
journal.
medical journal. And this study showed that after 7 to 9 months after being vaccinated, you started to see this negative efficacy pop up.
Is he saying that the vaccines are completely ineffective then?
Not necessarily. It's more nuanced than that, I would say. What he seems to be suggesting is that the vaccine's long-term effectiveness may not be as straightforward as we were initially led to believe.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. He brings up high-profile events, too, like the Gridiron Dinner and that Carnival cruise where everybody was fully vaccinated, and yet there were outbreaks anyway. So that kind of throws a wrench in the whole vaccines prevent transmission idea.
Yeah, those were definitely big news stories. Didn't Dr. Fauci's messaging even change on this at some point, too?
It did. Initially, it was all about the vaccines prevent infection and transmission. But then as time went on and as these new variants emerged, he kind of had to walk that back a bit and acknowledge that maybe there were some limitations.
Right. Okay, so we're seeing a potential decrease in effectiveness over time, and maybe not as much prevention of transmission as we were initially told.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the takeaway here?
I think so. And it's not just in the U.S. either. He points to data from the UK, New Zealand, Israel, all showing this same trend of increased susceptibility in vaccinated people over time.
Huh. So this vaccines-only approach maybe wasn't the whole story then. And Kennedy Jr. goes even further, claiming that there were alternative treatments that were deliberately suppressed. What's his basis for that claim?
Well, this is where things get a little bit more controversial. He argues that the regulations around emergency use authorization, they actually create a barrier
Oh, interesting.
to approval if there are already effective treatments for the same illness.
Yeah.
He even brings up his earlier book, The Real Anthony Fauci, which gets more into the weeds on that topic.
Okay.
And then he compares what happened in the U.S. to what happened in places like Haiti and Nigeria.
I remember that they had low vaccination rates, but also low death rates, right?
Exactly. And the difference was that they relied much more heavily on these alternative treatments like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine.
So he's saying that maybe focusing so heavily on vaccines in the U.S. actually could have been detrimental in a way?
That's his argument. Now, I should say that the effectiveness of those alternative treatments is
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
highly contested. It's very controversial. He does point to Uttar Pradesh in India, where they did widespread distribution of ivermectin, and seemingly cases went way down. But then you have studies like one funded by the Gates Foundation that didn't find strong evidence for ivermectin being effective. So it's really tough to say definitively one way or the other.
Yeah. It sounds like a complicated situation with very strong opinions on both sides.
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder, if these alternative treatments were even potentially viable, why weren't they at least discussed more? Why wasn't there more research? Kennedy Jr. seems to think information was being controlled.
Yeah, that's a big theme in the book. He's very critical of what he sees as this lack of transparency and a deliberate effort to suppress certain information.
Okay. And he even points to the New York Times admitting that the CDC was withholding some data, right?
They did. And then you have Pfizer and the FDA trying to keep their vaccine trial data confidential for something like 75 years. It's a little unusual, right?
Yeah, a little suspicious, right?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, what else are they hiding?
Yeah.
He also brings up this whole thing about excess deaths in 2021. Companies like One America, this big insurance company, reported like a 40% increase,
Yeah.
highest in their entire history,
Crazy, right?
largely among younger people. But the CDC downplayed those numbers, right?
They did. They tried to attribute it to other causes. But Kennedy Jr. really focuses on the data from the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VA-EARS.
Yeah.
This is a national database that recorded over 29,000 deaths, reported deaths, following COVID vaccination. That's more than all vaccines combined over the past 32 years.
Wow, that's a huge number. And if I remember correctly, he claims that's just the tip of the iceberg, right?
He does. He cites this study by the Department of Health and Human Services that suggests that VA-EARS actually underreports adverse events
Wow.
pretty significantly. And he even mentions reports from a German health insurer that estimated millions of vaccine injuries. And then you have these credible estimates saying that there could be hundreds of thousands of deaths in the U.S. alone linked to vaccination.
That's pretty scary. He also talks about all these healthy young people, especially athletes, experiencing these sudden cardiac events. I remember he cited data from that website, Good Science, that's compiled almost 1,000 cases. And it's really disturbing to think about schools having to equip themselves with defibrillators and even normalizing the idea of heart attacks in children.
It's really frightening, right?
It's crazy. And then there's that increase in ambulance calls for cardiac events among young people in Israel, a country with a very, very high vaccination rate. So it seems like there's a lot of evidence there that requires further investigation. He even mentions Pfizer's own trial data, which apparently showed a 23% increased risk of death and a 400% increased risk of cardiac arrest in vaccinated individuals, which is pretty huge, especially if that information wasn't widely communicated. Is that something he focuses on in the book?
Yeah, transparency and informed consent are definitely major things for him. He argues that people weren't adequately informed about the potential risks, and he's a big advocate for open discussion of both the benefits and the risks of vaccines so that people can make truly informed decisions.
So, if the vaccines aren't the perfect solution they were made out to be, and there were potentially viable alternative treatments that were suppressed, where does that leave us? What does Kennedy Jr. think about the overall impact of the pandemic response on society?
Well, that's what we're going to get into next. He really challenges liberals to consider how the pandemic and the way it was handled may have actually contradicted their core values, especially when it comes to supporting the most vulnerable people in our society.
That's really interesting. I can't wait to hear more about that.
Let's get into it. He really doesn't hold back in his critique of what he calls lockdown liberalism and the impact it had on working class people and even on basic freedoms.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's dive in then.
So Kennedy Jr. argues that this lockdown liberalism that he talks about actually ended up hurting the very people that liberals traditionally try to protect.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like how...
Well, he questions whether lockdowns really took into account the different experiences that wealthy people had compared to working class people.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see how those experiences would be very different.
Totally. And he points to that massive wealth transfer that happened during the pandemic, where billionaires got way richer and the middle class really struggled. And then there's the impact on children, which is something he feels very strongly about.
Yeah. What are some of his concerns about the impact on children?
He talks about the mental health crisis among young people, the learning loss from schools being closed, and all the developmental delays, particularly for younger children. He even cites this study claiming that American toddlers lost an average of 22 IQ points because of lockdowns.
22 points. Yeah. Wow. That's huge.
Yeah, it's a staggering statistic. And he ties this back to his main argument, saying that these policies were more of a war on the poor than a genuine public health response.
So he's basically saying that liberals accidentally contributed to making inequality worse by supporting these lockdowns and other policies.
That's the core of his argument. And he doesn't stop there. He goes on to criticize the erosion of civil liberties that happened during the pandemic, which he sees as a very dangerous precedent. Yeah, he argues that basic freedoms, the right to assemble, the right to protest, even freedom of religion, these things were kind of infringed upon in ways we have never seen before.
He even compares it to the Patriot Act after 9/11, which a lot of liberals opposed at the time, right?
That's exactly his point. He sees those parallels in how fear and national security were used to justify these limitations on civil liberties. And he says these measures ultimately hurt our democratic values.
So in his view, the very tactics that were used to combat misinformation ended up silencing legitimate concerns and alternative perspectives.
That's his argument. And he doesn't just blame the government for this. He also criticizes the media, especially this thing called the Trusted News Initiative, which is like this group of major news outlets that he says actively worked to suppress anything that challenged the official narrative.
So he sees that as a form of censorship that ultimately makes people trust the media less.
Right. And he even points to the financial ties between pharmaceutical companies and media outlets, suggesting that there might be a conflict of interest in how information about vaccines and treatments was presented.
Is he saying that the information we were getting was biased to help the pharmaceutical industry?
That's kind of what he's implying. He claims that the government spent over $1 billion paying news outlets to promote COVID vaccines, which he sees as evidence of this undue influence. He argues that this financial incentive created a situation where dissenting voices were basically shut out and crucial information was hidden from the public.
That's a pretty serious claim. And it goes back to his point about the lack of transparency and the suppression of alternative viewpoints. It seems like he's suggesting that there was a deliberate effort to control what people were hearing and to silence anyone who disagreed.
That's definitely a key takeaway from his book. He's arguing that the suppression of dissent has actually been counterproductive, like it's alienated people and pushed them towards more extreme viewpoints.
So it's like, in trying to protect people from misinformation, we might have actually made things worse and created more fertile ground for conspiracy theories and distrust.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's trying to get at. He says open debate and a willingness to consider different perspectives, even ones we might disagree with, those are essential for a healthy democracy.
That's a powerful message.
Again,
It makes you think, by shutting down certain conversations, maybe we've actually given more power to those who hold more extreme views.
he definitely thinks that's the case. And he says it's been particularly damaging for the Democratic Party.
How so?
Well, he argues that by embracing censorship and basically demonizing anyone who questions the official narrative, the Democrats have alienated a lot of working-class voters who feel like their concerns aren't being taken seriously. And he even suggests that this has pushed these voters towards right-wing figures like Donald Trump, who are happy to take advantage of that frustration.
That's a pretty harsh critique of the Democratic Party. Is he saying that they've lost touch with their base?
Essentially, yeah. He thinks they've become too focused on identity politics and cultural issues, and that they've kind of lost sight of the bread and butter economic issues that are most important to working class people. He says this has created this void that's being filled by these right-wing populists who can tap into those anxieties.
So he's not just criticizing specific policies, he's actually questioning the whole direction of the Democratic Party.
That's right. He's calling for a total change in their priorities. He says they need to refocus on economic issues and the needs of working class people if they want to stay relevant.
That's a bold statement.
Yeah.
It seems like he's really trying to shake things up and force liberals to confront some uncomfortable truths about themselves and their party.
Absolutely. He doesn't hold back at all. But it's not all just criticism. He does offer a different vision for how we can move forward, a path that he thinks is more in line with the true spirit of liberalism.
I'm curious to hear more about that. What are some of the key parts of his alternative vision?
Well, he starts by suggesting a more decentralized approach to public health, one that gives more power to individuals and communities instead of relying on these top-down orders from the government.
So more local control instead of a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. He also emphasizes the importance of transparency and accountability. He thinks we need to rebuild trust in our institutions, and that can only happen through open and honest dialogue, admitting when mistakes have been made and learning from those mistakes.
Yeah, it makes sense. If people feel like they're being lied to, they're going to lose trust in the system.
Exactly. And he thinks this applies to all institutions, not just the government, the media, scientific organizations, even corporations.
So it's a call for more integrity and honesty across the board.
Yeah. And he also emphasizes unity and reconciliation. He says we need to bridge those divides that have been made worse by the pandemic and build a more just and fair future for everyone.
That seems really difficult to do, especially given how divided things are right now.
Wow.
How does he think we can do that?
He says it starts with open and honest dialogue, even when it's hard. We need to be willing to really listen to each other, try to understand where the other side is coming from, and find common ground, even when we don't agree.
That sounds like a challenge, but maybe it's an opportunity too.
He sees it as both. He thinks we have more in common than we realize. And if we can connect with each other on a human level, we can start to heal those divisions that have been tearing us apart.
That's a hopeful message. It seems like he's asking for a fundamental change in how we approach politics and even how we treat each other.
He is. He's challenging us to be more compassionate, more understanding, and more willing to work together to make a better future.
I think a lot of people could get behind that, no matter what their political beliefs are.
He hopes so. He believes this is the only way we can solve the huge problems we're facing. Climate change, economic inequality, all of it. He's calling for a new kind of politics, one that's based on empathy, compassion, and working together for the common good.
It's a powerful vision. But it doesn't stop there, right? He also talks about some very specific problems with how the pandemic response was handled and some dangerous trends that have emerged.
Yeah, that's right. And some of his most interesting arguments are about this concept of the biosecurity state and what he sees as a loss of individual freedoms in the name of public health.
That sounds intense. What does he mean by biosecurity state?
He's talking about how governments around the world have used the pandemic as an excuse to get more power to watch people and control them. Things like contact tracing apps, vaccine passports, even lockdowns. He says these are all examples of how our freedoms have been restricted for the sake of public safety.
So he's worried that these measures, which were supposed to be temporary, could become permanent, even after the pandemic is over.
Exactly. He thinks these measures represent a big shift in the relationship between individuals and the government. And we need to be really careful about the kinds of precedents we set during a crisis.
That's a valid point. It's easy to see how people might be willing to give up some freedom in exchange for feeling safe when they're scared. But what happens after that? How easy is it to get those freedoms back?
That's the question he's asking. And he says we need to be really careful about protecting our rights and liberties, even during emergencies. He's worried that the biosecurity state could be used to control and oppress people. And we need to resist any attempts to make these measures the new normal.
That's a scary thought. The idea that the pandemic could be used to create more authoritarian society.
It is, and it's not just about the government having too much power. He also talks about how big tech is involved in this emerging biosecurity state. Specifically, how social media companies have been used to censor people and control what information gets out there.
So he sees this as a threat to free speech, right?
Exactly. He argues that these tech giants have gotten too powerful, and we need to figure out how to hold them accountable and make sure they're not being used to silence people or manipulate public opinion.
That's tricky. We want to stop the spread of misinformation, but we also don't want to create a situation where only certain opinions are allowed.
That's the challenge. And Kennedy Jr. thinks we should err on the side of free speech, even if it means that some offensive or controversial ideas are out there. He says a truly free society can handle different viewpoints. And if we try to suppress dissent, it's just going to make things worse.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But he doesn't just stop there, does he? He also criticizes this group he calls the Davos class, this global elite that he says is out of touch with the regular people.
Right. He says this elite, which includes billionaires, CEOs, and other powerful figures, has benefited a lot from globalization and technology. While the middle class has been struggling, he thinks this has created a lot of resentment and inequality that's causing political problems and unrest all over the world.
So he sees this Davos class as a driving force behind a lot of the negative things we're seeing. The inequality, the political division, the weakening of democracy.
Exactly. He argues that their pursuit of profit and power has hurt regular people, and we need to find ways to limit their influence and create a more fair and just society.
That's a pretty strong critique of the people in power. It sounds like he's calling for a major change in how our societies and economies are organized.
He is. He thinks the current system is unsustainable and unfair, and we need to find new ways to distribute wealth and power more equally.
That's a big challenge. But I think a lot of people are starting to agree with him.
He hopes so. He believes we're at a point where we need to make some fundamental decisions about what kind of world we want to live in. He's calling for a change in our values, moving away from materialism and individualism towards a more compassionate, just, and sustainable way of life.
That's inspiring,
Yeah.
but also a little overwhelming. Where do we even start to address problems that big?
He thinks it starts with awareness, recognizing the problems and understanding why they're happening. And then we need to find ways to organize and create movements for change that can challenge the way things are and demand something better.
It's like he's calling for everyone to wake up and realize we can't keep going down this road.
That's a good way to put it. He believes that we have the power to create a better world, but it's going to take a big shift in how we think. We need to reject the values and ideas that have gotten us to this point.
That's powerful. It reminds us that we're not helpless. We can shape our own future.
Right. He wants us to take control, step into our power, and build the world we want to see.
This has been an incredible conversation. I have a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners do too.
I hope so. The point of this deep dive was to present some difficult ideas and get people thinking critically.
And to inspire them to act.
Uh-huh.
Because if we just learn about these things and don't do anything, it's pointless.
Exactly. So what will you do with this information? What actions will you take to create the world you want to live in?
Those are great questions for everyone listening to think about as we wrap up this deep dive. It's amazing how all these different things, vaccines, lockdowns, censorship, the Davos class, they all connect in Kennedy Jr.'s book. It's kind of a dark picture he paints, but he does offer some hope, right? He talks about a different way forward.
He does. He thinks we can choose a different path, one that's more in line with what true liberalism should be, focused on giving power to individuals and making communities more resilient.
So what are some of the key parts of this different vision?
Well, he starts by saying we need a more decentralized approach to public health, moving away from these top-down mandates from the government and giving individuals and local communities more power to decide what's best for them.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach from the federal government, we'd have more localized decision-making.
Exactly. He also talks about going back to the basic principles of informed consent, especially when it comes to medical stuff. Like, people need to have all the information about both the benefits and the risks so they can make their own choices.
That goes back to what he was saying before about being transparent about vaccines and not suppressing alternative treatments. It seems like that's a really important theme for him.
It is. Transparency is crucial for him. He thinks it's the only way to rebuild trust in institutions, which he says is really broken right now. He says we need to demand more accountability from our leaders, from the scientists and doctors, from the media.
And he's not just talking about holding the government accountable, right? He criticizes corporations too, especially the big tech companies.
Yeah, he's really critical of how these big tech companies are using what he calls surveillance capitalism. He thinks they have way too much power, and they're making money off of our data while also controlling what we see and think through algorithms and censorship.
So he's saying we need to do more than just regulate these companies. We need to completely rethink their role in society.
Right. He thinks we need to take back our digital privacy and find ways to break free from these tech giants.
That's a tough one, especially since we're all so reliant on technology these days.
It is tough, but he says it's necessary if we want to protect individual freedom and prevent this kind of technocratic dystopia from happening. He even warns about how these technologies could be used to control and manipulate people, especially in the context of this biosecurity state he talks about.
It's scary to think that the things that are supposed to keep us safe and make our lives easier could actually be used to take away our freedoms.
It is a scary thought, and he's very serious about it. He says we need to be super careful about giving up our liberties, even in emergencies, especially when the people in power have shown that they're willing to take advantage of those situations.
So it's not just about changing specific policies. It's about a bigger cultural shift towards being more aware and more vigilant about these things.
Exactly. He's calling for people to get more involved, to start thinking critically again, and to actively participate in shaping our future.
It's like he's saying, we need to become more conscious citizens, more aware of the things that are happening around us, and more willing to stand up to those who threaten our freedoms.
That's a great way to put it. He believes we have the power to make a better world, but it's going to take all of us working together to hold those in power accountable and to challenge the way things are.
It's a powerful message, and it really fits with what this show is all about. The deep dive is all about exploring new ideas, questioning things, and encouraging our listeners to think for themselves.
And to do something with what they learn, because just knowing about these things isn't enough. We need to take action and actually try to make a difference.
So as we finish up this deep dive into Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s A Letter to Liberals, we want to leave you with this question. What are you going to do with this information? How will you use it to make choices in your own life and help create the kind of world you want to live in?
It's something to really think about, because the future isn't something that just happens to us.
Yep.
It's something we create through the choices we make, the actions we take, and by believing that a better world is possible.
That's a great way to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep pushing for what's possible.